provocateur.media.
It's not the plain vanilla white people who test the limits of our liberties. It's people who act differently, live differently, behave differently, who really test how robust our Charter of Rights really is.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to the Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, and today we have all three Goldwaters: Anne-France Goldwater, a senior partner at Goldwater Dubé. We have Dr. Samantha Goldwater-Adler, clinical psychologist, and Daniel Goldwater, attorney at Goldwater Dubé as well. Welcome back, reunited, the three Goldwaters.
Hey, Dan. Nice to be here. Although I didn't go anywhere.
Nor did I. Where was I?
Well, Daniel was on vacation.
Yeah, I was gone. I missed you.
Welcome
I'm back.
Daniel. We love you.
Goldwaters Unite. Yeah, I missed you guys. I was gone, and I'm back, and we're here, and I love you.
Awesome.
Oh, we love you too, Daniel. Welcome back.
All right.
So today's episode is about everything, really. I mean, free speech. It's where all these discussions begin. So we'll talk about free speech on campus, free speech and violence. We're seeing more violent rhetoric now in the United States, unfortunately. And we'll also talk about this very controversial cultural appropriation debate that has been going on in Canada. But let's start now with free speech on campus. And this has been an interesting issue for a number of years. Andrew Scheer, recently elected as the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He wants to pull funding from any university that would stifle free speech. So this leads to a number of problems. I mean, where do you draw the line, of course? We've been talking about things like Israeli Apartheid Week for many years now and how some people view that as inappropriate. Also, anti-Trump messages on campus, that is getting some scrutiny. What do you think about the state of free speech on our campuses today?
I think it is problematic, and I don't know. I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, in principle, I actually support the initiative to cut funding to campuses that stifle free speech. But of course, without a policy that's drafted with actual details, it's hard for me to endorse it without having great reservations as to how it would actually be applied. That said, in terms of Israeli Apartheid Week, I mean, I'm a graduate of Concordia University, and at the period when I was going there, this was shortly after 9/11, and there was a lot of, it was well publicized campus conflicts in terms of politics. You had pro-Israeli groups like Hillel and anti-Israeli groups that were clashing and
like all of Concordia.
Well, at this time it was at a fever pitch, and there's a documentary about it, Discordia, which was somewhat popular. But that said, it never occurred to me to shut down on either side. That was never my thought. If you have in other words, if there was something like Israeli Apartheid Week, I'm not sure there was one at that time at Concordia. My thought wouldn't be that this should be shut down. My thought would have been is today that you should have a debate about the issue, maybe have a parallel sort of week that makes the other side's arguments. And so I don't know, and I don't think, even though this Scheer fellow is definitely a true conservative, I imagine he'll be more sympathetic to rightists that are being suffocated in his perspective. But I don't think that the policy that he's proposing, I think, can be applied to both, right and left.
I agree that it could be applied to both, and I'm you touched on this briefly, but I'm deeply skeptical of him applying it equally to both sides of the political divide in terms of what free speech is actually being stifled and when to withdraw federal funding. It's something that, on the most part, I'd prefer the government just stay out of unless absolutely necessary. I do think it's honestly, I have mixed feelings about this, because often the things that are hitting the press in terms of the speech that's being stifled, I tend to agree. I tend to often think that, okay, the people that are being prevented from speaking are often unpleasant, malicious, or crap-disturbing agents, and can be deeply disturbing to people that are listening to, and can really kind of sully a campus environment. That said, do I think that they should be stopped from speaking entirely? I don't think so. I share your view that I think that there should be, that the greater instinct should be to have other talks with opposing views to be able to present both sides of the argument. I do think that people are fully in their rights to protest, and I think that is a very reasonable response if there's somebody who is coming to speak who you find objectionable, as long as that protest doesn't prevent them from speaking, as long as it doesn't turn violent or result in property destruction. And finally, one thing is that although in a perfect world, if I had my magic fairy wand, it would be great to just, kind of shut up everyone I disagree with and everyone I think is spouting, harmful rhetoric. I think there's often paradoxical effects, and that's where I find it really, even more disturbing. Is that oftentimes when we try to stop certain people from speaking, we actually give them more popularity, more money, more press attention, and we elevate them to a level that, frankly, they should never really achieve. It makes them seem a lot more important, then all of a sudden they become free speech freedom fighters instead of just, often whack jobs.
Yeah, but my understanding is a lot of protests are not necessarily about stopping the person from speaking as much as voicing your disagreement with their message. Those are two different things.
Which is exactly what I'm saying I'm totally down with. I think it is perfectly reasonable for people to protest and say, as many do, to voice their disagreement with the speaker and what they're presenting, but as long as it doesn't sort of turn into something violent or suppressing speech or involving property destruction, because that creates kind of a toxic environment in the university campus, and again, paradoxically ends up boosting the popularity and the message of the person that you're trying to speak out against.
And just also creating a great polarization. I mean, also when there's this precedent that's set, when there are windows that get broken, there is property damage that goes on. I mean, these poor universities, I do have sympathy, because they're not saying that we're doing this because we disagree with the message. We have security concerns. That's what ends up happening. That's the argument that they put forward later on when they do deny requests by certain groups to have controversial speakers. And I can understand that. I don't necessarily think, as I've heard some people, friends on the right, say that these universities are kowtowing to these left-wing agitators and that they actually maybe agree with the politics of the left. I think that it does become a great logistical and security nightmare. But you want to say something, Mom?
Look how quiet I've been listening to my children.
You can speak. It's okay. We won't stop you.
Protest.
We won't fight you.
You won't put me in that old people's home and visit me alternate lengths. So here's the deal. First of all, when you ask about cutting funding to universities, I would answer, what funding? Kids don't seem to think they have to pay for an education, and the parents of those kids don't seem to think that they have to pay for an education. I was revolted by the number of children whose parents come from the posh district of Outremont who were picking up their children at police stations during last year's riots about university tuition. And I was like, what is going on? Why are these parents not paying for their children? Now, that said, there's a reason. Because those parents and those children and the professors who are on those campuses, certainly in universities in the province of Quebec, are so rigidly left of wing that these kids were proud to hold up a flag or wear a T-shirt with the image of Che Guevara, one of the world's great terrorists, and they think nothing of it. That's how rigidly left-wing they are. And these people can't tolerate if you have an Ann Coulter or a Milo Yiannopoulos who come to speak, no matter how inconsequential and ridiculous some of these characters may be. If you think that free speech thrives on university campuses in Canada, you are laughing at me at the very least. When it actually comes to free speech, you have to recognize that as an attorney, I favor free speech, including offensive speech. All I have to do is not listen. And I've always thought the best way to defeat some of these right-wing populist, nationalist, xenophobic numbnuts is to not give them attention. Don't listen to them. Don't attend their events. Don't protest their events either. And just invite some reasonable speakers to come along.
So are you for or against the initiative? I still haven't gotten an answer from you.
I think the initiative is ridiculous and counterproductive.
Okay. And are you for or against Israeli Apartheid Week? So you think that if universities are holding, let's say, Israeli Apartheid Week, then they should be left to their own devices with no interference in their funding, nothing stopping?
But no funding should be provided. The real question...
So their funding should be stopped. Okay, so that's exactly...
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying
what funding?
The university should not have to spend money, unauthorized money. It should not have its money robbed to finance speakers of dubious, intelligence and dubious credibility. If you're a student
So
group,
including an
if
Ann
you're-
Coulter or Yiannopoulos.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, Anne Franz, do you believe that something like Israeli Apartheid Week should be tolerated on Canadian campuses as a part of free speech?
The danger in Canada, which doesn't exist in the States, is that here we have rules against hate speech. And those rules were set down by our Supreme Court in more than one judgment. They were always 5-4 judgments, which indicate that even the Supreme Court is very, very divided on the question of the legitimacy of limiting any speech. You know, all of this, I have to tell you, was before the genocide in Rwanda, and I think everybody's thinking has evolved. And we all recognize that hate speech is something real, it's palpable, and it can bring people to commit heinous acts. So it's not as benign as it might have been in the 18th century. Now, that being said, I think a lot depends on what in fact takes place. I don't think I can give a blanket approval. We're a family who are a product, who have been directly impacted by the Holocaust and what hate speech against Jews means and results in. And there is no question that although criticism of any country is legitimate, I wouldn't get up in the morning if I couldn't make fun of Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump on different days for different reasons, right? So I would like to think that Israeli governance is just as subject to analysis and criticism and sarcasm and maybe even very powerful attacks, but those attacks have to stay verbal. And I think that part of the problem is that many of the people, not all, but many of the people who want to engage in that criticism are not engaging in that criticism because they have something legitimate to say about the governance of Israel, but that they are in fact expressing deep race hatred and actually seek our extermination. And if we don't have the wit to object to it, we will be exterminated sooner or later.
I've never heard of any Israeli Apartheid Week that is calling for out-and-out extermination of the Jewish people. If there is one, if that goes on, then for sure that should not be tolerated. That's kind of where I draw the line. Short of that, go ahead.
I agree with Daniel. Having spent, I did my undergrad at Concordia as well. I spent a lot of time there, and I never felt I felt that some of the dialogue was disturbing, but I never heard any call for genocide or for death or any harm to my personal safety. If you get to Israeli Apartheid Week, I think, I'll just defer to Canadian law. So if there's calls to wipe out peoples, then that's a problem. Don't do that. You should stop that. But short of that, then people are allowed to speak. So then organize other talks with other reasonable speakers that have other things to say.
I agree with Samantha. I mean, looking back, as toxic as it was, and it was rather toxic. I mean, the rage that you would see on campus between these dueling groups and ideas was palpable, and it was a serious thing. But again, it never reached a level where I felt that there was a serious call for violence or genocide or ethnocide. I felt my personal safety was at risk. And moreover, looking back, those really polarizing debates actually were instructive. I learned a lot.
And go ahead. Sorry.
I think that's part of the goal of being in university is to hear, the ideal is to hear all sorts of ideas, no matter how taboo or out there, and feel safe and learn from the synthesis.
Let me ask the lawyers this. Where does the law stand on free speech in Canada? Is the threshold for problematic speech different than that in the U.S.?
Yes, it's very different between the U.S. and Canada. In the United States, there really is no limit and no threshold. In Canada, there is a limit, and the limit is hate speech. Now, that can lead to some very absurd situations. For instance, you could want to talk about fostering conversion therapy for gay men, and that gay men should all want to have therapy to become heterosexual in their desires, and that's hugely offensive and disrespectful, in my subjective opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would really take umbrage. I should be told to change. But that's still not the same as saying, were you to say, kill all the gay men, that's hate speech because it calls for violence against an identifiable group.
Daniel, as an attorney, do you feel that strikes the right balance, or are we too severe on speech in Canada?
Well, it depends on its application. I remember, I'm trying to blank now, who was the fellow, the Nazi sympathizer from Germany, who had come here and who was banned from speaking because there was concerns about hate propaganda? Zundel.
Yeah.
Right, who was a Holocaust denier, along with fellows like David Irving back in the day, at that same period, a British scholar who denied that the Holocaust happened. I found that problematic. That this would be a crime to put out an argument which is either true or it's false, and at that point they were banned. I believe. I mean, I have to do more research on this, but they were banned not because they were calling on inciting people to commit genocide against an identifiable group, but because they were denying facts of history. That they considered to be hateful and encouraging bad groups in society, and I found that personally as something of a libertarian, I found that very problematic. I think that's when you start getting into thought control, and you start getting into attacking history and having history on trial. And I think that there is something like a free marketplace of ideas, and you do make these people into martyrs, and ideas deserve to be discussed and debated, short of, yes, a direct incitation to murder these people.
Well, here's the deal. He was charged and convicted for inciting hatred against an identifiable group. Let's keep in mind, interestingly, he was, as a German national, he was originally detained in the United States and deported here. And here he was detained for 2 years on a security certificate because he was considered a threat to national security. Now, that being said, he was deported to Germany and he was tried on outstanding charges of incitement of Holocaust denial. Because remember, the rules about free speech when pertaining to Holocaust denial are much more stringent than here. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he only served 3 years.
So let me ask you, legal expert, lawyer, family, and this is something I just don't know the answer to, so I'm really curious what you have to say about. What about cases like pickup artists that want to come give talks to tell men how to, how to pick up women, for example, by grabbing them physically against their will to get their attention, or by plying them with alcohol to lower their inhibitions, things that would be considered, I think, assault here, or sexual assault here. Where's the line in terms of free speech and incitation to violence? Does it have to be an extreme level of violence, or would that type of speech, that type of pickup artist speech, be covered under Canadian law?
I think it's an open question. Again, at the time when this was in the news here in Canada about speakers from the pickup artist community coming to speak, there were petitions that were signed who claiming that this was a violation of our hate speech laws here in Canada, but it's an open question. There was no trial, there were no charges that were laid, and I'd have to, of course, see the actual things that were written specifically, because you get into legal analysis, you have to see exactly what was said, what was published. But I mean, it does seem that it's an open question, so it could potentially, yes, cross the line. I don't think the level of violence is at issue. Violence, if you're advocating to sexually assault someone, it's sexual assault by definition is violent.
The encouragement to men of engaging into sexual relations with women without their consent, rape, sexual assault, is an incitation to violence. And anybody who gives that type of advice or counsel or speech or presentations, in my mind, can and should be indicted under our hate speech rules. I think that what happens is the Crown, because we've seen this in certain instances with certain types of characters who've tried to come to Canada to share in that type of hate speech that passes for men's rights speech, that there's been a certain timidity by the Crown here even to attempt to prosecute. And part of the problem then is that you end up putting the responsibility into people's hands, ordinary people, where it should not be, where people do feel then that they have to engage in protest to prevent speakers like that from coming to Canada. I'd remind you, terrorism was in this country back in 1970 with the Front de Libération du Québec, and Quebecers rejected terrorism at that time. But terrorism comes often on the shoulders of people who speak hatred. And it's the speaking of hatred that leads to hateful and violent acts. Is this a time where we can bring in President Trump, perhaps, as like a prime example of somebody who promotes race hatred?
I hesitate to bring it back to the Nazis. It's a uncomfortable subject for all of us, I think. But in the context of this Trump administration, the fact that he's backed, at least in part, with some support from neo-Nazis, there was this debate online a while ago about whether or not to punch a Nazi, and this became a very sort of hot topic. Is violence ever justified in a civil society, even when directed against people who themselves have violent rhetoric?
No, never. Absolutely not. No.
I also found that the way the question was phrased when this was going on, should you punch a Nazi? I found it was kind of, because when people say Nazi, it's one of those words that's become so loaded and so powerful. You have in mind this
or so empty and meaningless.
But I think you think of an active Nazi like, with boots and all, like trying to kill people in a
jack boots, I think you meant.
In a concentration camp versus somebody who espouses Nazi ideas. Like, there's a little bit of a distinction. I think what comes to mind is that you are sort of a hero by punching an active Nazi during World War II. And it's a far cry from having a blog post or saying a speech where you think that white people are supreme and there should be no more black people in America, to saying go out and stab black people in their homes, or I have an actual plan to do this. I mean, there's a line that's crossed.
Well, let me just ask a provocative question, because on a very surface level, I totally agree with you, Daniel. But I'm just wondering where the line starts to be crossed, like where you can draw this line. So if you're saying that there should be, for example, there should be no more black people in America, and that it's a blight on white power and whatever other nonsense. So you're not saying directly, go kill black people, but you're saying, wouldn't it be great if there were no black people because they're actively harming us and they're a threat to our very white existence? Some horrible speech like that. Isn't that an incitation of violence? It's not quite.
Well, you don't punch
direct.
them. That's vigilantism. You call the police. The state has a monopoly on force, on use of force. So it's not your role.
Which
to do
isn't
that.
to say that the person might not need a good punch in the face, but you have to man up and take the consequences. Because when you just said that now, I don't have a horse in that race, but I have to tell you, when you spoke the words, you made my adrenaline rise. I'm smart enough to know that when other minority groups are disrespected, they're coming for us next.
I don't care whether they're coming for us next. I still don't want my neighbors to be hurt.
Not the issue. It brings up to me,
Yes.
up inside me a very visceral reaction, not
That
an
we're
intellectual
all
reaction,
that we're all in the same
visceral reaction to want. Just a sec, I want to deal with the punch in the face thing. It makes me want to do that thing I would otherwise say no to, which is punch that person in the face. When I think with my mind of a lawyer, not just my emotions, an elan of self-defense, because all that rhetoric is always dangerous to me. I take it as a threat to my existence if you disrespect my black neighbor, my Muslim neighbor. That's why you know how many times I've spoken up to defend Muslims, especially here where there's been a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric, and that's part of the reason. But I'm mature enough to recognize that if I did have to punch the person in the face because he needed punching, I would take my time. I would take my punches back for that. I would go before a judge and say, yes, I did the wrong thing. I punched him in the face. You must punish me, and you can punish me now. So because I want to respond fairly to the question. It's too easy for us in the safety here of our living room just to say, well, of course not, and we mustn't, and you shouldn't. The reality is, you don't know how you would react in such a situation. You're talking very, very charged situations, and you're deliberately using an example where you're trying to provoke your brother into noting that somebody doesn't have to directly say, let's kill all the black people, and still convey a message that is one of exterminating black people. And I don't know if I could restrain myself. That's the real truth. And I'm an old lady here doing it. I can't. You do lose a little bit of control when you hear that type of
But that doesn't
speech.
justify the action. Like
It
you just
doesn't
said,
justify. We're agreeing.
Yes, you would hang your head before the judge, say guilty as charged. That's what you're admitting.
100%.
And why? And that's why it's
Because
interesting.
it's wrong. Because the coarsening of the social dialogue in recent years is really, really, really scary. And if we don't redouble our efforts not to have physical reactions, for me, it threatens civilization. Believe me, I'm not that worried about people who are coming to speak at university campuses. I'm way more worried about Twitter and Facebook.
Here's the real challenge, though, and I think what this Nazi word evokes is, what do you do when the government fails? I mean, that's the real question. If you go back into Nazi Germany, that's always the big debate is, well, when the state is now is supporting these types of calls to violence, and you as a liberal or someone who wants to fight against this, then are you justified in taking violence into your own hands and engaging in vigilantism? Luckily, so far, we don't live in a democracy gone rapacious and violent in Canada. But were that to happen, that's where I think the morality starts to change.
Well, and let me just add to what you're saying and extend it a little bit further, is that, a lot of times the groups that are being targeted by this very vitriolic, kind of aggressive speech are often marginalized groups to begin with, who don't necessarily feel totally protected or represented by...
Their feeling doesn't really matter. Call the police.
Are not represented or adequate. Yeah, are not represented or adequately protected by the government and by the systems that we have in place.
And who don't wield power.
Slow down. If someone is saying in a public forum, kill all black folk, and it's a black person that hears that and calls the police, if give me a case where the police are like, no, sorry, this is free speech.
Well, how about this? How about even just very, very recently, where a 30-year-old woman with small children at home who was pregnant called the police because there was a burglary, and then only for the police to arrive and then shoot her in front of her children. There are certain communities. Yes, this happened quite recently. I can go look up the name and everything. And this was in the United States, of course. But yes.
That's how they say hello.
But
in the
I'm
States. They need more guns, Samantha. You don't understand. In the States, they just don't have enough guns.
That's what's obviously going to help. And so there are certain communities who, for real reasons, do not trust.
For every example that you gave of that, there are plenty of counterexamples of people who have been saved because of the police in black communities.
Absolutely.
But
that doesn't
Samantha,
change proportionality.
She was a black woman. I just found it.
That's what I just said.
That was her point.
That was your point.
Yeah, and she was pregnant with small children in the home and had called the police for help and for protection and was shot in front of her children.
Her name is Charlena Lyles. She
Yes.
was shot dead in front of her children.
Yes, and so
But
I think
there's
that
no
there's
problem in the United States.
Right, of course not. Well, I think that there's still, but it's a statement of fact that historically and even presently that there are certain marginalized groups who tend to be disproportionately the target of discriminatory speech that do not have the same protections that other people have, other people in power have in our society. And so it's telling those groups to say, well, just call the police if someone says something you don't like.
Well, something criminal, something you don't like. Let's be clear.
Sure. If someone's inciting violence against you, then call the police. Then some of those communities may say, thanks, tried that, and it didn't work out so well for us.
I don't know how many tried that in that specific example. You were talking about something, there's a burglary. We're talking about hate speech. It's a bit of a different situation.
You know what I'm getting at. I'm just saying that there's certain communities that have different treatment by the legal system and by the police system than other people do. And those groups tend to be the ones that are predominantly targeted by hate speech and discriminatory speech.
And they're going to get themselves in more trouble if they take the law into their own hands. So
they should just default to the current system that they don't feel is currently protecting them and may shoot them even if they're under actual direct threat of violence.
So when it comes to punching the Nazi, obviously legally bad idea, but sometimes especially as this rhetoric gets more and more heated, Samantha, I mean, it's awfully tempting if you're in a tense political atmosphere to maybe once in a while punch a Nazi.
I think, I totally agree, and I do think it's absolutely tempting, and particularly if you feel that what somebody is saying is a threat to you, your family, your neighbors, your community, then that would elevate all sorts of fight-flight hormones that would come rushing through your system and really, propel you to want to act and to do something and want to protect or harm the person that you feel is the threat to you or to your community. So I think there's a huge temptation to act on this. The question becomes, whether we ought to actually follow through. And I think, sure, there's some people that could really use, maybe really deserve a good punch in the face, but it doesn't mean that we should necessarily follow through on it.
Yeah, but hold on. Is it because in your question, Dan, you're making a distinction. You said clearly illegal, but as though it might still be moral. So what is your answer to that? Do you think that therefore it is, sure, it's illegal to punch someone in the face, but you think it's moral because you have fight or flight response because someone says something threatening to punch them? That's moral?
I didn't say that it was moral. We've had a lot of debates about what exactly morality is.
I'm asking
you and I. Do I think it's moral to punch a Nazi in the face? Well, you tend to defer when you get to morality. I tend to go on intention, and you tend to go in terms of consequence of the action. If we're going to look on your definition of morality and look at the consequence, is the consequence going to be good or bad? Well, the consequence in the moment may be, let's say, good because someone gets harm inflicted on them for spouting harmful rhetoric. However, it also then creates a tit-for-tat kind of environment and atmosphere, and may give that person more of a pulpit to speak and a bigger voice, thereby converting more people to their beliefs or giving them more attention than they are due. So by your definition of morality, then no, I do not think it is moral.
Well, hold on. I never define what I think. don't try to pigeonhole me in terms of what the definition of morality is. You just said, so to harm somebody who is doing harm is moral.
I did not say that.
Well, I thought that's what you were suggesting. Or what is it that you...
That's
what is your
she was
position?
suggesting.
So what exactly? So what is it? You're being slippery. You're evading. You're dodging.
Do I think it's moral to punch a Nazi in the face?
It's a yes or no
Could
question.
it potentially be occasionally moral to punch a Nazi
My
in the
answer,
face?
just to be clear, so you're not like left dangling there. If the Nazi is coming at you, about to punch you, or has like a knife
come
in his
on,
hand, then
that's
it's
okay, yeah.
then that's obvious. That's
Well,
where I draw the line.
yeah, but that's
But
obvious.
if a Nazi is there saying Nazi stuff, no, you don't punch him. It's pretty evident. And if
No, I don't think. Well, I think
even
it
if my
goes
blood
even
is
further.
boiling and I have impulse
I
control
didn't say-
problems,
well,
none
I
of
never-
that makes it
I never
justified.
Of course, I never said that it actually makes
Well,
it justified. I
okay.
just said that it could be very tempting to do it,
Sure,
but it doesn't
I'm
mean.
tempted all the time to do stupid stuff all the time.
So we do have a unanimous no on punching Nazis, but so
On
let's
punching.
let's talk about now government sort of stepping in to regulate some of this more heated political rhetoric. This time, let's talk about Bill C-16, which tries to protect members of the LGBTQ community, especially the trans community, expanding the definitions of those who can of the groups under which these hate speech laws are applied. What is your take on Bill C-16, and do you agree with critics like, among others, Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto, who believe that this is an infringement on people's free speech?
It's a hugely short bill. I have it open in front of me. And all it talks about is when it speaks to prohibited grounds of discrimination, again, for purpose of hate speech, they're adding gender identity or expression to the list of ethnic origin, national origin, race, religion, age, sex, marital status, family status, disability, and conviction for an offense. And I'm going, well, what's wrong with that? It seems to me like the most natural thing in the world not to want to target and it goes really to the aggravation of a crime. If you commit a crime and part of the nature of the crime is to make it a hate crime because you're targeting somebody for the purpose of your assault, let us say, and you're targeting someone because they're a member of an identifiable group, it is a factor of aggravation. I mean, I don't even know to what extent any of this needed to be codified to begin with, but I think it's an awesome civilizing force that these things are codified. I find it very sad that humans need to be reminded. I mean, it's bad enough you need a criminal code to be reminded not to hurt other humans, but you even have to add the particular mention. And by the way, not only is he or she a fellow human that you should not be assaulting or raping or killing, but in the bargain, if you're doing so with extra added attention and criminal intention because the person is gay or transgendered or black or this or that or the other religion, well, that does make the crime more heinous. I don't know how it affects
hold
my
on,
free speech.
Again, for my understanding was that he was being, again, in Peterson, this is before this legislation was passed, but I guess now it's been given force of law, that he was forced to use the gender-neutral pronoun for trans students.
But where do you get that? I don't see
that
he was
wasn't.
forced.
Well, hold on. That was from a internal faculty.
Nobody
guideline.
says we're changing our pronouns. The criminal code is not the guide to English grammar.
I understand. In terms of criminal code, I'm just saying what led up to this. What Peterson's debacle was. Yes, I agree. Independent of federal law or of provincial law.
So Bill C-16 is not impeding anybody's free speech. It's just absolutely ridiculous. There's like such an escalation that goes so contrary to what I thought was the original tenets of the right, as I always understood the right to be, which is laissez-faire and laissez-vivre. You know, they don't call it laissez-faire capitalism for nothing, but they're implicit in there is the laissez-vivre part. The idea is the supremacy of the individual, and that what's important is that every Canadian has a right to his vision or her vision of the good life, And that means and within that vision of democracy and capitalism means that you should be able to express your gender identity and your orientation and your hair color and your religion and all the other aspects that are of you.
I think that Peterson, Toronto professor Jordan Peterson was really making a very big deal out of this in the end, which resulted in a lot of financial gain for him and a lot of popularity for him. So good for him. But Senator Mike Gold, a constitutional law scholar, he noted that the legislation does not apply to those who mistakenly use the incorrect gender, but noted that the human rights law would only kick in when someone intentionally and consistently uses an incorrect gender, regardless of the harm it may cause.
So in Mr. Peterson's scenario, a student who is a trans person presents themselves and says, please use they or another pronoun. Mr. Peterson then refuses because it's against his beliefs, and then he is then sanctioned by the...
How could that be against your beliefs? What is that? Where does your...
That's his argument.
Belief systems come into it. The modification proposed, because it's another modification proposed to the Canadian Human Rights Act, is indeed the recognition of people's identification in terms of their race, national, ethnic origin, color, religion, etc., gender identity or expression. I've had this fight. I've been having this fight with my partner, Marie-Hélène Dubé, for so many years. It's probably been since before you were born. And where have I had this fight? I've had this fight in the whole debate about religious accommodation. And what makes, as a matter of fact, more often, what makes a Jew a Jew? Because, one of the big cases was Amselem of the Supreme Court in Canada, which pertained to the right of the Condo Association to prevent condo owners, I think this was Le Sanctuaire, from putting up a sukkot on their balcony. And what they did to accommodate their Jewish condo owners is they put up a general sukkot, I guess, in the main lobby, I guess in the way they would put up a Christmas tree, to show they were accommodating people of different religious beliefs. And in particular, this fellow...
Maybe just briefly touch for our audience of what a sukkot is, for those who do not know.
You're asking me to be the theological expert. It seems that harvest season, as we were making the transition from being random pagans to Talmud-thumping Jews, we decided to keep this original pagan tradition of putting up a hut at harvest season and to decorate it with all the stuff that you harvest. So, am I interested in this holiday? Not at all, which makes me a very mainstream Jew, I suppose. But that being said, one of the things that was deconstructed by one of the judges of the Supreme Court is that he noted, this particular judge, that some of the people who were involved in this case that went to the Supreme Court, in fact, adduced evidence, rabbinical evidence, and some rabbis said it is entirely sufficient to have a communal sukkot. You don't need to have an individual one on your balcony. And one of the fellows in particular apparently would go, I think, to his sister's house or his daughter's house every year because she put up an individual sukkot.
Can we get back to the
ongoing
debate with
So I argued that she wasn't really a Jew. I argued she wasn't a Jew. And my partner said, because these are two big Supreme Court cases in Canada, Amselem and Markovitz, and she argued against my position. And she said that in her vision of civil rights, if you self-identify as a Jew, that makes you a Jew. And if your belief about your religion makes you think you have to put up an individual sukkot or sacrifice a goat, that was entirely up to you. And you'll recollect in the States, there's a whole debate about this woman who pretends to be black. And she has a position, some high position in some subsidized group.
But isn't that the logical endpoint of this trans discussion? That was why this...
It is.
Well, to me it is as well. And look, do I have much of a problem? It comes down to a balance of rights. I mean, in the Amsterdam case that you're talking about, it always comes down to... none of these human rights are absolute rights. It always comes down to a balance of interests. And it becomes case by case. I mean, if you have somebody that is being denied... if it's no inconvenience to the person denying the rights, then it becomes more of an issue. But I mean, if someone is going to get in trouble for refusing to call a trans person, like knowingly refusing to call a trans person by their preferred pronoun, and then gets into trouble with the state, I do find that frightening.
Well, and that's something that I'd love to know if that's actually what the law applies to, because that's what Senator Mark Gold was implying. But then in terms of the National Lawyer Group, they were saying the amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act will not compel the speech of private citizens. So I'm not entirely clear.
It's dishonest. I think it's a dishonest statement, what they're saying.
which is a dishonest statement.
The first, that this will not compel the speech of private citizens. Of course it will.
No, I think that the point that was made before is that it would apply to federal employees. But from my perspective, it doesn't directly cause a problem because I would expect people without the benefit of the Canadian Human Rights Act or the Criminal Code to show that regard for people. But it was quite interesting if you start reading a little bit about the debate that this created for private citizens. What if you do believe as a simple matter of science, because it is a simple matter of science, that people are biologically male or female or hermaphroditic? There are actually people scientifically hermaphroditic for more than one reason.
Well, yes, and there's people with androgen insensitivity syndrome, and
there's
people
people
with
a parasitic twin who might have different Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome, XYY and XXY. So
yes,
there's that.
And people who are genetically male but present female because they do not absorb, their body produces testosterone but doesn't absorb it, and so what would they be called?
Yeah, but a lot of people who are transitioning do not fall into those categories.
The people who are transitioning, who as a matter of conscious choice go from one sex to another, don't disturb me because I believe in that constitutional value of each person, each Canadian being entitled to live his or her vision of the good life. Because if we can't respect that, then we don't really have a Charter of Rights that has any meaning. So I think it's profoundly important for all of our liberties, right? Mm-hmm. Needless to say. It's not the plain vanilla white people who test the limits of our liberties. It's people who act differently, live differently, behave differently, who really test how robust our Charter of Rights really is. So I do think it's hugely important to respect.
Let's end with another controversial speech issue, the cultural appropriation debate. This was very hot in Canada earlier in the spring. There was some media people in trouble over their suggestion on Twitter they would start a, quote, appropriation prize. Firestorm ensued, and a couple of media figures resigned or switched jobs or even let go. What do you think about the controversy about the appropriation prize, belittling, I suppose, members of certain cultural communities? Do you think this was an appropriate joke to make, or is this the kind of speech that could and should get people in trouble?
Personally, I think, even if we get beyond the whether this type of speech should be restricted or not, it was just, I read the article, I read the call for the Cultural Appropriation Prize, and it was just, it didn't really make a point. There was no argument there. It was just a one-off. It just felt like a one-off, okay, we need to fill a page, let's throw something in and throw in a controversial term, and boom, let's go, we have to get this to press right away. It didn't strike me as a real argument, or even frankly a real prize that was being offered. It got sort of turned into something else, and people jumped on this bandwagon. But I find it difficult to debate the merits of it when there was no real argument being put forward. It was just something kind of thrown out there.
Well, I think he was making an argument. It's a bit of satire involved, but I think it's clear what his intention was. He was very black and white, saying that writers should be encouraged to imagine the lives of other peoples and to exhibit them in their writings. And this should be encouraged, and that it's silly that it should not be.
Yes, but that's just
an argument.
Is that really an argument? Why? What's
because
why?
He was saying most writers in Canadian literature are middle-class white people, and they're afraid of engaging in cultural appropriation, which leads to a lot of bland literature that is not compelling. And when he cares about Canadian literature,
I don't think he was saying it's because it leads to bland literature.
I think it's exactly what he said.
Is that exactly what you're saying?
The writer at the center of this controversy was arguing that it is the right of a writer to appropriate other people's culture in a work of fiction.
And moreover, that it should be encouraged, that this might be, in fact, a good thing to try to imagine and exhibit the lives of others.
Well, sometimes my country embarrasses me. I mean, clearly we have nothing important to think about. I worry about the end of democracy. I worry about, World War III erupting because of North Korea. And then I have to read the type of debate that can create angst amongst Canadians. All the fellow wrote is, stop writing just about what you know, which is the common advice older writers give to younger writers. And he said, try writing about things you don't know and peoples you don't know, and imagine what you could construct, which I presume means writing with research. I don't think it means writing like on numbnuts and pretending you have any idea about how other peoples live without making an effort to learn and convey it. But I don't see why you're disqualified as, I don't know, let's try something, a Muslim person wanting to write about Aboriginal communities, or why, if you were an Aboriginal person, you wouldn't want to write about a Jewish community. There once was this terrible movie called A Stranger Among Us that goes back to 1992, starring Melanie Griffith, and it's a very romanticized view of the ultra-Orthodox community. And I found it hugely funny because it's, first of all, not only is she WASP, but whoever came up with this movie was so WASP it was to cry, right? But it didn't delegitimize the movie in my eyes. I didn't sit there like shaking my fist at the screen. How dare non-Jews pretend to be able to write about an ultra-Orthodox community? And believe me, it was highly romanticized and certainly didn't show certain truths, let's say, I might know about what it's like to be a married wife and mother in an ultra-Orthodox community where you are a walking womb and have to have many, many, many children and take care of them. So I don't see why the suffering of any community only belongs to members of the community. I don't get it.
You just engage in cultural misappropriation by speaking to the troubles of ultra-Orthodox women, because you're not an ultra-Orthodox woman.
Doesn't matter. I get a pass because I'm also a Jew. Hoo-ha!
Yeah, but it's a continuum. How close do you have to be to the culture? I mean...
Well, there you go.
It's ridiculous.
When I saw it, the subjective perception I had was twofold. One, that WASPs were writing about a community they didn't know, that they didn't know about, and maybe I was wrong, right? But that's certainly what it felt like on the screen. And two, I snorted in derision at the failure even to attempt to show the reality, what it would like to be, frankly, any woman in any culture, where you're stuck having more children than you should be having, and that you have a huge amount of responsibility. And here, making the Sabbath challah was almost a holy experience, and there was none of the fatigue and none of the misery, and I've seen a lot of that. And as I said, you're right, though, it could apply to many communities, traditional communities, where women have to have children and don't have a choice to limit the size of their families.
I agree with you that it's more about the level of outrage that shocks me. It's that,
exactly.
I've seen tacky treatments of all sorts of subjects out there by people who don't know what they're talking about. And to me, it's like, okay, I'll critique it and I'll shrug. I'm like, okay, bad piece of art. And it doesn't matter who the author is. Frankly, I've seen things that, say that the person has the cultural right to talk about their own culture, and they also do a tacky job at exhibiting it. I mean, a Jew can get Jewish issues wrong. A black can get black issues wrong.
I would sincerely hope people wouldn't think my vision of my community is the only authentic one. That would be absolutely ridiculous. I'm not any more qualified to speak to realities within the Jewish community than within the Christian community or the Muslim community. And one of the nicest articles that by accident I was reading that just sort of peripherally touched on this pointed out that one of the things we fail to do in modernity, oddly enough, is to sit down and discuss with different people. So if you, let's say you are part of, let's say you're part of a feminist group. I'm going to throw something out there because I think I've experienced this. So let's say you're part of a feminist group on campus. If I were in charge, I would want to invite fellows to come speak to their experiences and learn more about the issues that are preoccupying guys, which fosters dialogue between men's groups and women's groups and gets us to find solutions for both groups. And the reason I mention it is I had it when I was invited to Ottawa to speak on women's issues in amending the Divorce Act many years ago, and there were representatives of men and women's group, and you felt the tension in the air. And I remember saying, whoa, fellas, the reason you're here today legitimately asking for a bigger role in the home and in child rearing and bigger recognition in the family courts is because women paved the way for you by asking in their generations for a bigger role in the workplace. So hello, we have a lot to give to each other. And it was written up, I think, at the time, the Ottawa Citizen. This is a long time ago. But I really foster dialogue. I believe in that.
I I agree. I think the dialogue is very important. I think that writers from people from other communities, I don't think there needs to be a blanket ban on them appreciating or having or representing other cultures in their work, be it artistic or in writing or in artistic writing. I think ideally it's something that should be done with respect and some research, and just rather than this kind of rather than a farcical or offensive presentation. And let me go a little bit further in terms of whether it causes harm or not. I'm going to quote First Nations writer Robert Jago, who says, do I care if you have a native character in your stupid book about wandering pants or whatever? No, write anyway. It doesn't affect me. But if you're writing about Native politics, or if you're writing about crime or drug use or abuse, that stuff affects us. By writing us one way and not understanding us properly, you are misrepresenting us and reinforcing harmful stereotypes. You might not think stereotypes matter, but they do when you're Native, and stereotypes prevent you from getting painkillers for an injury.
Now, what if a Native had gotten it wrong? Had wrote something similar, wrote something that this fellow found getting it wrong and that was putting his community interests back, but it happened to have been a Native guy that wrote it. This is the problem that I have. It's the ad hominem nature of all this, that the person who is writing it is being evaluated on how whether or not they're an authentic member of the group. That's really.
But I think what his point is, and I don't want to get into his head, but my understanding of his point is that if you're going to write about Native politics, then whoever you are, it behooves you to know what it is that you're talking about.
But who the hell is he? The censor? The judge? The high school teacher? He's there. Not. Here I was hugely, hugely affronted. That really, really bothered me. And it started make me think of impressions I had crossing Canada back in 1978 and what I saw. And I guess I better never write. And thank God I didn't, because my biography has been written, and I'm glad, I suppose, that there was no chapter in what I saw in Canada in 1978 from Vancouver to here, driving through cities, towns, villages, and the things I observed that I guess this fellow, Robert Jago, would think, well, who are you to write about our community and our difficulties?
But also, it's also a banal statement. Like, if you're going to write something that has political connotations or suggestions, do your homework. It's like, okay, thanks for letting us know. Because what type of an observation is that?
Well, because obviously, I think a lot of the times it's not, and that's the point.
A lot of the controversy is due to establishment media figures joking about what they described as a cultural appropriation prize. So some people perhaps felt excluded, that this was a joke to some people, or that a lot of publications were already suppressing minority voices and then would now engage in encouraging cultural appropriation. So in that sense, perhaps I'll turn to you, Samantha, and ask, even though we are quite open about free speech, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its consequences, and doesn't mean that it can't lead to feelings of exclusion among certain groups.
Oh yeah, I think that I think on the most part, it behooves us, I was going to say writers, but it doesn't, not as writers, but just as citizens, as humans who live in a society, to try as much as possible to be respectful of other people and to recognize that our actions have consequences. Now, overall, I'm going to default on free speech. Sure. And should you be able to write about other people's experiences, even if you don't know your ass from your elbow? Okay, sure. But ideally, just try to be respectful and try to be mindful of what you're doing, and that your actions, particularly if you have a louder voice because of you're in a position of power in society, that can have real consequences for the people that you're talking about. So for me, it's under the category of, it's not something I'm going to legally restrict, but just, the general rule of try not to be a jerk. That's it.
Samantha gets it like dead on. At the end of the day, that's the part I believe in deeply, and I think it's the awesome part of Canada that I think that we don't celebrate enough, and it's a part of the Canadian national identity that, in my hugely subjective opinion, marries very well with the Quebec national identity, which sounds very funny, right? And I really wish we celebrated more of that, which is that you have two peoples who, notwithstanding a whole lot of other differences, are very engaged in the concept of laisser vivre. Let people live as they want to live and respect people as they are and take them as they are. And it's so funny, again, that two very different peoples, certainly different across the pond, but have grown here on this side of the ocean with that tremendous gentleness in our respective souls. And I would love for that to be a theme to bring Canadians and Quebecers closer together, because it's something that keeps me going. That it brings social peace, it brings social harmony, it brings a tremendous sense of security as a member of a minority group here in Canada when you compare us to the lot of many peoples in the United States who must be living in a state of abject terror with the current government that's in power. So, I think we do a spectacular job of protecting free speech here. I think some of the turmoil on the fringes needs to be better managed, but of course it takes a lot of delicacy. I'm not always the best person to express that delicacy.
I mean, what concerns me in this debate is that there's this increased focus on the messenger and their ethnic background. I mean, if this original offending article on cultural appropriation had been written by a native person, it obviously wouldn't have made a stink. And I find that's to me is what's very concerning. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, every writing should be contextualized. You should look at the author. You can't just be completely say, just treat the production independent of the author. The author has a story. But this idea that you're not allowed to, this is outside respectable discourse, to be commenting on something that is outside of your cultural experience and that you should be pilloried and seen as a jackass in society, I think is very dangerous and frightening. I really do. And I think that I could think of so many times when there's been cultural sharing or there have been other people outside cultures that have produced something that has been a beautiful contribution. One thing that came to mind, actually, while I was listening, while we were having this discussion, was a documentary, The Fog of War, by Alain Resnais, I think it's in the 1950s, and it was this Syrian documentary about the Holocaust. And this was a very daring documentary at the time, because it's actually real footage of the camps that were liberated and the conditions that the survivors had at the time. And this was by a pure Frenchman, and it's I don't know, it was a great contribution. And some people might find it offensive. Some people might say, oh no, he's objectifying the pain of the Jewish people and he has no right to. I mean, you could find your angle. And I just think that you're kind of angling for a fight over something that is unwarranted.
Further reading on the topic of free speech could literally be anything at all, guys. What do you think?
I'm going to recommend actually an article, and it's on blacknerdproblems.com. And the article is titled Fully Appreciating Cultural Without Appropriation, A Guide in 15 Steps by Letitia Jones. I think a lot of times when the debate comes to cultural appropriation, a lot of us get the idea that we're trying to entirely stifle people from being able to appreciate or be able to comment on other cultures or be able to, just really enjoy saris and buy one in India and wear one for a special occasion. And that's not necessarily what the actual message is. Cultural sharing, cultural appreciation are still important things. And I think that sometimes we need to introduce a little bit of nuance. And I think that in this article by Letitia Jones on Black Nerd Problems, I think it gets some very nice rule of thumbs for people that are trying to figure out how to still appreciate other cultures without, being a jerk.
I think of The People versus Larry Flint, film from I think now it's the late 90s with Woody Harrelson as Larry Flint, and part of the core of that story was about the boundaries of obscenity laws. This was the 1980s when Jerry Falwell had sued the Hustler magazine for publishing an obscene comic about him, and he claimed defamation. And a lot of these debates about is it your right to just have bad taste or to get something wrong, like to have some sort of free speech that might be offensive and upsetting and outrageous, but it is still your absolute right to do so. So I think that film comes to mind, and it's a great film for all sorts of reasons, great performances.
Well, I have two books to recommend. One is Why Religion is Immoral and Other Interventions, a collection of essays by the late, great Christopher Hitchens, which I'm recommending mostly because I miss the Hitch so much, and because it shows to Goyu that even for people who started out left-wing, they can acquire wisdom and come into the light. And reading him can only elevate your understanding of the issues. And the truth is, and I say it with a certain trepidation, but I think I do want to recommend Something Fierce, The Memoirs of a Revolutionary Daughter by Carmen Aguirre, not only because I voted for her book in 2012, and she is a Canadian, but because I think it's important for many of us to engage in something that is part of today's divisive identity politics and rhetoric, which is this clash of civilizations between the white people and brown people, or Muslim people and Christian people, and we're always looking at it through that prism. Whereas here's a case of a person who is a Latina woman who was fighting, in fact, in Chile against Augusto Pinochet. It's very fascinating, certainly if you fancy yourself a little bit on the right, to read the memoir of an avowed left-wing terrorist and recognize that something good came of it and that something was accomplished by terrorist resistance, which challenges many people's way of thinking. Like when we said here, no, you should never punch a Nazi. That's easy for us to say because we live in the safety of Canada. She didn't. Carmen Aguirre, and you still have to admire her courage to stand up to that tyranny, even if the means deployed might be means we might eschew. And I think so it can make you reflect on the concept of freedom of speech through the prism of somebody else's experience. I'm not suggesting cultural appropriation of the Chilean experience, but I certainly have really excellent memories of reading the book and learning the history.
Goldwaters, thank you very much. And France will be taking a bit of a pause. We'll see you again on July 25th for a special episode on simply Montreal, the city where we all live and where this podcast is home. And you will address some rumors and France on July 25th.
Rumors about me? How could that possibly be, Dan?
You will announce whether or not you'll be running for mayor of this fine city. So mark your calendars, July 25th. We'll see you then. Thank you, Goldwaters.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Provocateur.media